Welcome to the Retire with Peace podcast, the podcast where we help you create a fulfilling and stress-free retirement. Each week, we bring you expert advice, practical tips, and inspiring stories to help you plan and live your best retirement life. Whether you're nearing retirement or already enjoying your golden years, this podcast is here to support you every step of the way. Let's embark on this journey together and discover how to retire with peace.
Welcome back to the Retire with Peace podcast. This episode is sponsored by CWOs for Hire, which is the financial planning firm that I co-own. If you are looking for help with your financial planning, feel free to reach out to us. You can find us at cwosforhire.com, and you can book a time directly on my calendar using the link on that website. When we talk about retirement planning, we often hear the phrase, yes, but, and it's followed by, yes, but what about this? What if tax rates change? What if interest rates change? What if COVID lasts longer? What if this person becomes president? What if inflation keeps running high? There's always a lot of, yes, I understand this planning, but what about this? And what we've seen time and time again is what comes at the end of that phrase, whether it's tax rates, interest rates, inflation, political, you name it, anything that comes up. And we hear gold and silver and Bitcoin and everything thrown in. Take your pick. Pick anything that would follow the phrase, yes, but what about blank? All of those things have happened historically. Some things will happen that we've never even thought of before. But what we've seen from history is that those things are very temporary, most of the time. And by temporary, that could even mean a couple years or a handful of years, or sometimes even a decade. But if we're doing planning properly, we can mitigate, some cases eliminate, but a lot of times mitigate the impacts of those things if we are structuring things properly. Again, what we heard during COVID is, what if COVID lasts for a long time? What we heard for a long time, my goodness, probably the better part of a decade, is what happens when interest rates go up? We were worried about that way back in 2011, 2012, 2013. At the time, I was in a corporate job, and I was handling, part of my job was to handle a big chunk of a bond fund. And that was the big concern back then was, oh my gosh, interest rates are going to go up. And how do we manage this with the bonds that we were invested in? It took a good decade for interest rates to go up. So a lot of times the things that we are concerned about do happen. Sometimes they never happen. Sometimes they just happen later. Our job is to set a plan and execute on that and adjust as needed, which we've talked about quite a bit recently. But we hear all these things about interest rates and COVID and all this stuff. And yes, it's important to think about, but if we have a plan in place, we can mitigate those. And the biggest examples that we have are, how do we handle tax planning? How do we handle structuring our investments? And today I want to talk about how we use retirement income guardrails, which we've talked about before. And not everybody calls them guardrails, just to be clear. So if you're out there Googling retirement income guardrails, you can get a whole bunch of different stuff. Oftentimes, they're more commonly called dynamic distribution rates, or if you're getting really technical, it's the Guyton-Klinger study from about 2 decades ago. So Guyton spelled Guyton, and Klinger, I'm going to look at, since I'm not great at spelling, Klinger. So those are 2 gentlemen who really came up with this study about 2 decades ago. And when we look at the study that they did, and the reason that we use retirement income guardrails is they were looking at, how can we get more out of our retirement dollars versus just sticking with the 4% rule, which is 4% rule is very common, very well known, and it works. It definitely works. It's just really too conservative. You can get more out of the money that you've saved up for retirement if you use dynamic distribution rates or something similar to that. So I'm actually going to read directly from this study because it's really important to understand that the time periods that they used in this study encompass a lot of things going crazy. So for example, they used two different time periods. They used 1973 to 2004, and they used 1928 to 2004. So one was about a 40-year period, one was much, much longer. As we think about those time periods, those beginning dates are really important. Because if you think about 1973, that was a terrible year to start a retirement because that really kicked off many, many years of really high inflation. And if you are somebody who is retiring currently or soon to be retired, you probably have some good memory of those years and the inflation that happened and the subsequent high interest rates, especially in the late 70s, early 80s. So, all these really, really challenging things happened during that time period. And yet, even during that 40-year window, you would have come out okay under these calculations and under this type of planning. Same thing with 1928. The roaring 20s was fantastic years for the stock market. Then 1929 hit, and all of a sudden now stock market's crashing. We're hitting the Great Depression for quite a long time. So in both of these cases, the sample sizes being used start with some awful time periods to be retiring and planning, and yet still come out fine. So it's just important to note that as we think about, yes, but what if this? Yes, but what if this? We talk about increasing tax rates, talk about inflation. You've got wars, you've got depressions, you've got, I guess we didn't have the Great Recession thrown in there quite yet. We have the dot-com crash. We've got all sorts of stuff that happened in these time periods. So all this, yes, but are important things to consider, but it shouldn't override the planning that we are doing when we talk about things like guardrails, dynamic distributions planning. So, the conclusion from this paper, and I'll quote the paper concludes that initial withdrawal rates of 5.2 to 5.6% are sustainable at 99% confidence standard for portfolios containing at least 65% equities. That's a pretty conclusive statement. It also talks a little bit about adjusting that equity allocation, which we look at in dynamic distribution planning. It says the 80% equity allocation provides greater purchasing power at slightly lower success rates. So we have to look at this and say, okay, we could up the amount that we have in stocks and ETFs that are invested in equities. We could get more out of it. The confidence rate, meaning the likelihood of success throughout the entire program, is a little bit less, but still quite a bit high. So it's a balance of to say, okay, how far do we want to push this or not? It's not that you're going to be broke and retirement is ruined. It's just if some bad things happen and you're too much allocated to equities, might need to cut back on the income a little bit more, especially while we wait for the market to recover. Lastly, it talks about with a 50% equity allocation, the maximum initial withdrawal rates drop to as low as 4.6%. So again, there we're being a little bit more conservative, only having half of the money in equity accounts, stocks, ETFs, mutual funds. And instead of getting that 5.2 to 5.6 range, now we're dropping down a bit to 4.6. All that being said, we're able to get more money out than just sticking with that 4% rule, which again, I will reiterate, the 4% rule works. It's fine. It's not going to necessarily harm you other than limiting how much you're taking out for retirement. It's just too conservative. It's not necessary. You can get more out of your retirement dollars. It's just a matter of understanding how these dynamic distributions work, which we've covered very specifically in previous podcasts. But even more importantly, understanding that these time periods cover so many of these what ifs that might happen. Now, we can get really extreme and say, well, What if the United States collapses and we're separated into 4 different states, and all of a sudden money's worthless, and half the people are in poverty? I mean, you can go into that extreme scenario, and sure, that would probably fall into the 1% interval in which this didn't work. So yes, you can go down that extreme path. We can't really plan for that. That's just not realistic to plan for the 1% item. There are certainly some things you can do. You can invest in real estate. You can pay off your house. That way you've got the house covered if something happens. So yes, there are some things that you can do to plan for that 1% or 0.5% or 0.25% freak thing happening in the future. It's not bad to think about that. It's not bad to necessarily address that in some form. But again, don't override your entire plan for this 0.5% probability that might happen. If we can use dynamic distribution rates and get a 99% confidence interval, that is amazing. For the statistics folks out there, you get 3 standard deviations. So it's really, really, I don't want to say impossible. Nothing's ever impossible, but it just doesn't make sense to try to plan for the 1% outlier. Let's plan for the 99%. Maybe take that 1% outlier into account in some form, but let's plan for the 99% and adjust for there. And all these what ifs can be adjustments along the way, understanding that if we're using this good planning, good tax planning, good investment structures, and good dynamic distribution rates planning, we can overcome a lot of what ifs by having these structures in place and executing on them properly.